one thing that Obama did that is good, which is not to say way off and start sentences, is that he did try to open up diplomatically to Cuba just a little bit towards the end of his second term. He actually went to Cuba and did some things that he could do unilaterally to loosen up restrictions on what U.S. citizens could do in Cuba. A lot of it he couldn't do without congressional authorization. And then Donald Trump reversed all of that. Trump, who, some very gullible people thought was going to, be anti-imperialist in some sort of weird right-wing isolationist way, was of course the exact opposite of that. He was much more hawkish than the previous administration in almost every category, and definitely including Cuba. And he tightened up restrictions a lot when he came to office. And Biden, unfortunately, since coming to office, hasn't loosened them back up again. He's made no effort to go back to that diplomatic opening to Cuba that happened under Obama. And the combination of this, what already is a very unnatural situation, that Cuba has been under some level or another of trade embargo with this giant piece of the world economy that's represented by the United States. And obviously Cuba's now largest natural trading partner since the Kennedy administration. But you place on top of that this worldwide pandemic that shut down their tourism industry, which is a huge part of the Cuban economy. And that was shut down for a year. I mean, they've only just started to reopen it, very recently. And the combination of those things has been absolutely brutal. And so Cubans have been experiencing lots of shortages, more than usual, of, food, medicine. They've been trying really hard to get people the COVID vaccine, but that also means there are trade-offs there, and there are other kinds of medicine that they can't import. And power, there have been power outages, and all of these shortages have sparked a lot of frustration and by Cuban standards, at least, big street protests. Not as big as have happened in other countries in Latin America, which is a point we should make, because 2 days of protests in Cuba get massive international news coverage, and months of protests in some other Latin American countries get a tiny fraction of that. But by Cuban standards, very big protests. And this, in turn, has led some politicians, like the mayor of Miami, for example, who are
one of my favorite guys. Just like
he's awful, awful, absolutely awful. In fact,
he's exactly what my city deserves.
So we've got video of him, talking about the protests in Cuba, but more importantly, what he believes needs to be done in response to the Cuban government. So we have two clips. The first addresses the sanctions that you referred to, Ben. Let's watch that, and I want to get a response from you.
Yeah, let's do it.
Ben Rhodes, who, of course, was national security advisor to President Obama, tweeted this: the Cuban people suffer doubly from a repressive government and a cruel U.S. embargo. They deserve policies that empower them and help them improve their lives. Do you think that President Biden, looking at this situation, will lift that embargo? And do you think that's what he should do?
No, I don't think the embargo is cruel at all. And I think that the Cuban people are not asking for a lifting of the embargo. They're going out on the streets every single day talking about the failure of the communist regime to provide for its people.
His Miami accent is just so thick. It's crazy. They're like going out on the streets talking about the communist regime, okay? Not the sanctions, bro. Like, it's not like what they're talking about.
Yeah, one thing that Nando and I have in common is we both used to live in Miami, and I think we probably both knew a lot of guys who sounded just like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean this is incredibly disingenuous, and there's a really easy way that you can tell that it's incredibly disingenuous, which is that, like, what we just saw, pick, right? It can't be both. Either it's really important to keep the embargo in place as a pressure tactic to get this horrible, evil, tyrannical regime to change its ways, or the embargo is just an excuse and really all of the shortages are just a result of flaws in Cuba's economic systems, because both of those can't be true. If it's not having a big effect on the Cuban economy, what's the point of the embargo?
Yeah.
Can I just go ahead, Nando? Sorry, I just wanted to elaborate a little more on the sanctions, because there is a common talking point among supporters of basically toppling the government in Cuba. And they argue that like the sanctions are not that big of a deal because it just prevents trade and travel between Cuba and the United States. That is not true.
It does way more than that.
It does way more than that. And the embargo and the sanctions were bad prior to Obama lifting a few of them, like loosening up the embargo. However, Trump not only re-implemented those sanctions, but he tightened those sanctions even further. So Cuba is considered a state sponsor of terrorism as a result of what Trump did. And so what does that do? It prevents international banks from doing business or financing the Cuban government in any way because they're worried about retaliation from the United States. Think about it. If you're a bank and you're thinking about doing business with Cuba, but the United States, a hegemon, refers to Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, you're probably going to be a little scared to do business with Cuba, right? So it really has hurt them economically. And what further compounded it was the coronavirus pandemic and how it basically did away with one of the main sources of revenue for the country, which is, of course, tourism. So Cuba's in a terrible place. The United States certainly has a big role in that. And, to pretend as though the sanctions are not a big deal, I think is ridiculous. But I think lifting the sanctions is the only thing the U.S. government can and should do. But anyways.
Totally, yeah. I mean, I was going to say, there's this talking point that you hear a lot that says, but they could trade with Canada, they could trade with Europe. So, like, what's the big deal, about the United States? First of all, that means that anything that's produced in the United States, which is like a massive amount of what exists in the world economy, you can't get in Cuba. Then that state sponsor of terrorism designation, which, by the way, like if you look at the official justification for putting Cuba on the state sponsors of terrorism list, which is something the Trump administration did like at the last minute. I mean, that was something that kind of did in between filing nuisance lawsuits to try to overturn the election. And the stated justification for that was basically that, Cuba and Colombia and, other countries, but I think Colombia primarily, don't have extradition treaties. There are people who are accused of things in Colombia who are in Cuba and can't be extradited back. But I mean, just not having an extradition treaty cannot possibly be good enough to make you a state sponsor of terrorism. And if it did, then the United States, I mean, how many people who've committed bombings and assassinations and hijackings in Cuba have lived openly in Miami since then? I mean, that would more than cut both ways.
What they say is that like Cuban spies are all over Latin America. Like they make the Cuban spy apparatus out to be like, these like James Bond level guys who are all over Latin America working with like the Venezuelans and stuff like that to like undermine everything. I mean, that's like what they say. But what I found remarkable about this round of protests is that, like, contrary to other flare-ups in Cuba, is that a lot of the more hardline Cuban elements are kind of saying the quiet part out loud that they didn't always used to say. I mean, there's always like the most insane people that would say like, nuke 'em. But like the mayor of Miami kind of went there in a way that others don't, that others didn't in the past, because like, obviously like the question is like, say it's, you're right, they're awful. The Castros are the worst. They're the worst people. What do we do about it? Huh? Well, we already do the sanctions. What do we do about it? Let's hear it from Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, let's hear it.
And what should be being contemplated right now is a coalition a potential military action in Cuba, similar to what has happened in both administrations, in both Republican and Democrat administrations. In Republican with Bush in Panama, they deposed Noriega, and that country had peaceful democracy for decades. And you had interventions by Democratic presidents, taking out Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. It's a sovereign country where they took out a terrorist that probably saved thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives, and President Clinton in Kosovo, intervening in a humanitarian issue with airstrikes. So there have been many, many opportunities in the history.
Are you suggesting airstrikes in Cuba?
What I'm suggesting is that option is one that has to be explored and cannot be just simply discarded as an option that is not on the table.
Jesus.
Insane.
It's a military coalition, all right, bro? Like, you do like a coalition of military stuff, okay, bro? And then you and then you bomb them, and then you get them out of there, bro. We've done it before. We did it in Iraq. We did it in all over the place, bro, and it was fine, okay? Like, why didn't anyone complain then?
Yeah, I do want to say, like, I don't think we should assume, like, lots of people in the United States have like the typical sort of Americans watching international news disease, which is that they watch 90 seconds of news footage and then they have like a complete read on the situation and who's right and who's wrong, and all of that stuff. And there's obviously lots of that going on the right, crazy right-wing anti-communist Cubans in Miami who are sure that anybody who's in the street must agree with them about everything, and I think you also get some of it on the left that, I think some people are a little bit too quick to assume that everybody who's frustrated by shortages, who might have one complaint or another about the government, might be protesting, is like a CIA agent or something, right? Like, I don't think we should do that. I'm sure, like, I think it's way too early to know anything really about the politics of different people protests. I'm sure there are lots of different factions, lots of different agendas. And also, like, that's, what happens in Cuba should be for the Cubans to figure out. The United States doesn't need
exactly
to have a vote in,
exactly. And who are we? Who are we, by the way? And who's the Miami mayor?
He's
to
the best,
say what the governing situation should be in Cuba. Bro, like language you can maybe understand. You just had a building in Miami collapse. You have other buildings in Miami where people are literally evacuating because they're poorly built and about to collapse. I mean, really, do we have any place right now to tell the Cuban people what's best for them? As we're experiencing like record inequality in the country, we're watching our infrastructure fall apart. Like, we're not really a good example of an economic system that works. So for us to say, like, we should topple this government and destabilize this country is disgusting and ridiculous.
Also notice that when he's talking about, like, U.S. intervention, his Latin America example, he has to go back to 1989 to Panama, because he's certainly not going to bring up the 2004 intervention when U.S. Marines kidnapped the president of Haiti, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, and took him out of the country to impose a new one, because obviously Haiti is undergone, like, continuously, like, dystopian levels of poverty and economic inequality and instability. The president of Haiti was just assassinated. This clearly did not lead to any sort of stable democracy in Haiti. He's certainly not going to bring up Honduras, where there was a U.S.-backed coup in 2009. He's not going to bring up
Libya. He's not going to bring up Libya. But the thing is that, what I was texting with a journalist named David Quinones out of Miami. He hosts something called the Bird Road podcast, which is like a Miami centric podcast, and he was pointing out that, like, there are protests on the street. There is probably a lot of genuine discontent. There is probably also, like, astroturfing and Twitter bots and all that stuff, like, which has happened in Brazil, which has happened in Mexico, which has happened in Bolivia, which has happened everywhere. It's like super proven and documented. Plus, the United States in Cuba has a huge record of this kind of thing, like creating their own version of Twitter and things like that, like a CIA Twitter in Cuba. But but there is probably some genuine discontent. But there was also massive counter protests, much like would occur here in the United States, like when there was like a Tea Party protest, and then there's like some other group of protesters who are like against the Tea Party protesters, and like so there's a massive counter protest kind of supporting the government. And the picture that everyone is using, and that was in that Fox News clip of the people climbing up the statue, is actually an image of the counter protest. There's a guy holding up the 26 de Julio movement flag, the red and black flag, which was like the vanguard of, faction of Fidel Castro from like the guys who came down from the mountains. That was a counter protest to the protests which are being covered, and it's just being treated as.
Of course, because it's like this. It's people have this like black and white like cartoon in their heads of like Cubans want freedom and they like they want to restore what we all saw in Godfather 2 to Cuba. But of course, like Cuba is a complex society, like any other society that you have like different political factions. You absolutely have like super right-wing elements of the Catholic Church and people who are aligned with Miami exiles and people who really are connected to the CIA. And you have people who, you have a huge popular base of support that's still loyal to the government. You have people who maybe like Castro but aren't crazy about the current guy, or basically want to maintain the system they have now in Cuba but want some reforms. It's going to be a whole spectrum like you'd have anywhere. But the overwhelming point I think that we need to make is just a really simple one, which is that the United States shouldn't get to decide who wins. Yes.
The immediate thing that has to happen is to end the United States' basically war on Cuba that has been going on for decades, and like then we'll see what happens. Like then we can debate about the government or whatever, but like any presupposition like has to be that to end any American intervention in Cuba, which it's not like it is happening right now. Like it's been happening for decades. Like that is the first step that has to happen before anything can be even remotely discussed about the merits of this government or its faults because it's crazy that's not the thing.
No, absolutely. I mean, like this the thing. Like people will say, oh, but if we end the embargo, then what's the incentive Cuba to change? Whatever. What changes or doesn't change in Cuba should have nothing to do with us. Right? This should be entirely for Cubans to decide what the future of their country is like. There's absolutely no reason the United States should get to influence that. And the other thing, like the crucial point is that if you want to help, like the thing that immediately sparked these protests were the shortages. Like everybody agrees on that. Whatever else is true, like that was like the immediate spark. And if you want to do something to alleviate the shortages, there's exactly one thing that the United States can do. And it's exactly the opposite of what the mayor of Miami is talking about. It's exactly the opposite of what Val Demings, who's a Democratic congresswoman from Florida, is talking about. Yes, says the White House must move swiftly. I don't know what that means, but it doesn't sound good. That the United States, the White House should be doing something to guarantee "quote unquote" freedom in Cuba. And we can look at all of the countries where, I mean, we just listed off a bunch of Latin American countries where there were U.S.-backed coups. But like what the mayor of Miami is talking about is more than that. It's airstrikes. It's maybe even invasion like Panama, and look at the recent track record of that. I mean, we're in the 20th year of the forever war in Afghanistan. The ripple effects of the invasion of Iraq are still leading to like waves of bloodshed and chaos in the Middle East. Libya was turned into a failed state by U.S. airstrikes and proxies overthrowing the government there. Like the track record of this makes it just amazing that anybody thinks that Cuba would be this like stable, prosperous democracy if the U.S. got its way. But again, like whether Cuba keeps its current system or has different systems should not be up to the United States. But if we want to do something to help the shortages that have immediately sparked the protest, just lift the embargo. And it's ridiculous. People pretending, this embargo, that's just an excuse. That really doesn't make a big difference, because the whole point of having an embargo is to bring about this exact thing. And that's explicit. I mean, you can go back and look at, like, even before Kennedy actually signed this in, when Eisenhower was initially considering imposing sanctions on Cuba, there's a quote from Eisenhower's in The Guardian today where he said, well, if the people are hungry, they'll throw out Castro. I mean, that was the explicit reasoning for doing this in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. And
like,
one other, go ahead, Nando.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to mention the recent change in leadership in Cuba because I don't know. I mean, I'm speculating, so I want to be clear about that. But, some of my concern is that Cuba is in a particularly vulnerable position because of this new president who was not part of the Cuban Revolution, of the Cubans who are very supportive of the communist government. They have a lot of respect and admiration for the Castros because of what they did in pushing for this revolution that wasn't a result of like the Soviet Union coming in and making it happen, right? It was a popular movement. And now you have this new leadership, and I'm wondering if there's and obviously we're speculating, but if there's this maybe air of distrust toward him. I don't know. I mean, I worry that that's also part of the equation, and that some bad actors, internationally speaking, are going to use it to their advantage to try to topple the government.
No, I think that's right. I think that Fidel Castro had tremendous personal popularity. Raul probably a little less so, and the current guy a lot less because he's not connected to that. But in terms of what, just to go back one more time to that lunatic mayor, what he's talking about, doing airstrikes and, some sort of military, the military coalition to topple the Cuban government. The fact that Cuba's system was not imposed by Soviet troops like Eastern Europe, that it came about as a result of a popular revolution, is really important to emphasize. Because realistically, what that means is, as bad as some of these other interventions have been by the United States, if Biden was insane enough to listen to this advice from the mayor of Miami, from Val Demings, from other people, that would be 1,000 times worse than some of these other interventions. That would be like the war in Vietnam, because if the United States was actually going to militarily intervene to try to topple a country that was brought about by a popular revolution that still has a huge base of support, what do you think all the communists in Cuba are going to do, right? If the United States empire comes in there and tries to get rid of their system by force, I mean, do you think that this whatever percentage of the population you think it is, it's still a big one, right? Do you think that Cuban communists would take that lying down, or do you think that they'd take up arms and do what they did to take power in the first place? And then that could be that could really be bad on the level of U.S. involvement in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia in the 70s.
No, absolutely, and I mean it's all the same thing. The same thing that was going on when Venezuela was in going through tremendous economic hardships, and there were protests on the street because there were massive shortages because the price of oil collapsed, and a million other reasons. Also mismanagement from the Maduro government, a million other reasons. And it's you saw like the new kind of the young bucks on the scene in Miami are the Venezuelan diaspora, or exile community as they call themselves. And it's well, what do you I'm well, what are you going to do about it? And they often advocate military intervention. They don't, they would never ever lift up the economic sanctions. If you want to help those people in Venezuela, the first thing you do is lift the economic sanctions. If there's shortages, lift the sanctions, bro. That's the first thing that's what's gonna help these people. Because you don't like the guy.
But that's never considered. No. It's always the way. I mean, we're going to talk to Danny Bestner later, and this is a very Bestner-esque point. But I mean, the way that we always talk about helping people who are experiencing some sort of civil war or economic crisis or whatever in other countries, it's always framed as either we help them by bombing them, or we just don't do anything, right? And there are usually lots of things that the United States, as a rich and powerful country, could do that aren't those two things. I mean, we could. In a case like Cuba or Venezuela, just stop intervening there to try to strangle the economies of those countries. That would be huge. In other cases, we can take in refugees. That's doing something. We can send like food and medical aid. That's doing something. Which way would be the least we can do in the Cuba case, because they constantly send medical aid all around the world. Yes,
exactly. And I guess the final thing I'll say about this is, so our good friend, Professor Wolf, does really great segments about, just updates on what's happening internationally. And one of his podcast episodes that I really enjoyed was about how Cuba was actually opening up its economy, not to multinational corporations. That would be a bad thing, but opening up the ability for workers to own the companies they work for, right? So worker co-ops, and that's like exciting stuff. And I mention that because my feeling is the Cuban diaspora is much less concerned about the well-being of Cuban citizens and just far more interested in toppling that government because of their unending bitterness and grudge over what happened in the 1950s. I just think if you do care about the well-being of the Cuban people, then you'd listen to what their concerns are right now regarding the shortages, and you would help to alleviate that. But they don't want to do that. They want to keep the sanctions in place. They want to crush the Cuban people to the point where they're so desperate that there's an uprising and they topple the government. That's the whole point of the sanctions. And the United States has no business intervening in any way, certainly not militarily or with these kinds of sanctions. They should be lifted. That's the only role the U.S. should play.